So some of the results that we've seen from this, Debian Woody was actually the first Linux distribution that supported HP's Itanium 2 systems based on HP's ZX1 chipset in a stable release. This was one of those funny things that happened just because we agreed that it was okay to include the IA64 port in the Woody release, and the timing of the Woody release was after we got things pretty much all working and before any of the commercial distributors had done another stable release. So it's not sort of all that hugely significant, but it's one of those funny little facts of history that I don't mind pointing out when I'm talking about cool things that have happened in our relationship with Debian. It is interesting, though, because it was an occurrence of something that we now are not sure we would want to support from the Debian side again in the future, in that we shipped something in a stable release where you couldn't actually buy the hardware to run that binary architecture yet. So it's all a little strange. But then one of the other interesting things that happened, again, because there was this time window where we had Debian bits available and the commercial distributions hadn't given us stable releases, where because of the rules that the spec benchmarking folks have, you can't submit a spec benchmark using a software recipe that a customer can't reproduce. So in other words, if you want to publish a spec benchmark, there is a time window in which you have to commit that all of the bits that were required to make that work will be available, you know, in sort of the normal ways. Unfortunately, that time window meant that if we wanted to use a commercial Linux distribution, we would have had to have waited some number of weeks, perhaps months, before we could publish benchmarks after the hardware was ready to be benchmarked. And that was something that we didn't want to do. So the initial benchmarking that we did for our fastest early Itanium 2 systems was done using Debian and a custom kernel, which allowed us to have a recipe that was easy to duplicate, because that custom kernel, since I was the IA64 kernel maintainer for Debian at the time, became the stock Debian kernel for the Woody release. And at the end of the day, it actually all worked very well. We published some industry record-making benchmarks, and the marketing guys were reasonably happy. And it is true that several months later, when we had a commercial distribution to use for the next round of the benchmarks, the numbers were even better. But that isn't so much because the distribution per se was better. It's because a few months had gone by, the tool chain had gotten improved, the kernel was faster, and all of those things. Nonetheless, this gave us several months of opportunity to go brag about our new hardware before we otherwise would have been able to. Another interesting little thing is that every HP Itanium system that has shipped to a customer that said Linux was going to be their primary operating system has gone out with a CD dropped in the box called the HP Enablement Kit for Linux on Itanium Systems, or something like that. That's actually a thinly disguised Woody installer CD that's had the cheroot blown up to a massive size, since you can get away with that on Itanium systems. And lots of extra tools put in, and one extra level of menu that allows you to choose some optional behaviors that aren't normally part of a Debian install, like restoring a factory pre-configured system image from another unit of media, initiating a system imager, network installation from a golden image server, and things like that. And it's actually been fairly helpful to some of our customers, though I admit it's long in the tooth and no longer nearly as relevant as it once was. And there are a bunch of other examples of where new hardware that we were ready to ship that we did not at the time have commercial distribution support for went out with Debian bits as the Linux that was available for it for some period of time before commercial distributions became available. And probably the most interesting example that I can talk about in public is that HP continues to sell a carrier-grade Linux solution for our telecommunications customers that's based on Debian with a custom kernel and some custom protocol support that runs on top of a specially NEBS-compliant modified version of one of our two-way Itanium systems. The customer that came to us, and is that readable? Okay, good. I was a little worried that putting this much text on would make it totally unreadable. It's not my normal style, but I snatched this out of another presentation and actually blew it up lots larger than it was before, so I guess it worked. At the time that the customer in question came to talk to us, Red Hat and SUSE didn't meet their requirements, either for features or schedule or support model, because What the telco customer that motivated us to do this work really wanted to do was for us to deliver them a piece of infrastructure that would consist of hardware and an operating system and some HP value-added components that come from our telco software people, which they would then layer their own proprietary telco software stuff on top of and sell to other customers who were the ultimate people who would go deploy this stuff. And once these machines were deployed, they wanted, 5 and 10-year support life for things that we were not accustomed to supporting that long, and so on and so forth. And it just was sort of a business model that was different than anybody in the Linux commercial distribution space was willing to chase at that time. We realized that there was an opportunity to sell a lot, a capital L lot of Itanium servers if we did this. And so we agreed to do the work and figured out how to meet this customer's needs with a Debian-based solution. I'm not going to go through all this detail, but there were some interesting experiences that came out of that. We figured out all sorts of things that we could do with relatively modest patching of the kernel and adding a couple of additional packages to the Debian system. One of the interesting examples is this OSPF routing support, where GateD for a long time was the daemon that people used for implementing OSPF on Unix-like systems, but support for it on Linux had basically been abandoned, and it wasn't clear what the answer was. We shoveled around some and found this other package and helped to motivate the activity which led to it being included in the Debian main distribution. It turns out it meets the customer's need and they're quite happy with it. So this is another example of, sort of where there was a cooperative effort that in the end added a capability to Debian that anybody can go use, but it happened to meet the needs of this particular customer, and so it was a valuable thing for us to fund the work on. Another example that I love to talk about when I'm in places where I can talk about it and not have people look at me sort of funny is that there's an R&D lab that does IC design for the chipsets that go around processor chips in our servers and workstations that was faced a year and a half or so ago with the fact that they had almost all of their stuff running on PA RISC systems, and PA RISC systems were rapidly approaching end of life. So they wanted to move to 64 bits. They wanted to, in effect, upgrade their infrastructure and replace a lot of stuff. In the end, what they decided to do, without any real urging or encouragement from me or the rest of the internal Linux community, was to go basically buy a lot of x86-ish systems and some Itanium systems and run Debian on all of them. And this has, done some really cool things for them. They've gotten faster machines just because it's newer hardware with higher clock rates and all those things that happen when you replace old boxes with new ones. But they've also been really excited about the productivity they get from running Linux instead of HPUX as the operating system, because now they have access to things like OpenOffice and VMware and so forth that work on x86 boxes running Linux that don't work on PA RISC systems and so forth. And in the end, it's of course lowered their total cost of ownership. And it's interesting that they actually went through a pretty serious evaluation before they decided to do this. There are some things that helped them to make this decision and to be successful making this decision. One of them is that they have their own dedicated support organization that is full of longtime Unix geeks who thought figuring out Linux was no big deal. And they were willing to do things that a lot of customers don't have the ability to do, which is why you don't see me hawking this as a solution for HP General customers. In particular, they were willing to go buy large numbers of licenses to expensive IC design tools that were officially only supported on Red Hat and figure out how to make them work on Debian, and at the end of the day feel okay about running them that way. And a lot of customers just don't know how to feel good about running things that are that far from being officially supported. But the bottom line is there are now a couple of major R&D organizations inside HP that are running effectively 100% on Debian, not just on Linux. I think that's pretty cool.